welcome to everyone. For this breakout session, we're going to be looking at community wealth building in rural areas. We've currently got 17 of us in this session just now, and hopefully some more will join in the next few minutes. We heard from Neil McEnroy and Joe just there in the last keynote session about the government's work on place-based initiatives and community wealth building in North Ayrshire. And in this breakout session, we want to look at whether community wealth building is something that smaller rural communities have been doing for some time, and if so, what lessons we can learn. After we hear from Thomas and Ailsa, everyone will be invited into the discussion to give their views and ask questions. And then, as usual, the orange box in the top right-hand corner will be where you'll be able to join with your audio and video to ask questions. For now, keep using the chat box. You can write your questions, which we'll come back to, and if you can, pose them with a question at the front so that we don't miss any. So I'll just introduce our speakers. Thomas Fisher is the founding director of CODAL, or the Community Development Lens, based in Uist in the Outer Hebrides, where he's been for almost 20 years. CODAL's research is on young people reviving island communities and triggered the Islands Revival blog and the Declaration. CODAL also runs the leader-funded Smart Islands project, which links Scottish and Irish islands. And Thomas also facilitates and coaches for the Social Enterprise Academy, is a consultant to the Scottish Islands Federation, and was previously Director of Enterprise and Communities at the New Economics Foundation. And Ailsa Clark, bottom of your screen, or bottom of my screen. Ailsa established Inspiralba in 2009 as a social enterprise with charitable status to assist community-based organisations to turn their ideas and aspirations into sustainable business activities. Over the past 11 years, she's worked with a broad range of social enterprises, from remote island shops to town-based cinemas, and from nurseries to community transport for the elderly. This is providing a lot of learning from the rural context, which has helped to inform wider discussions around policy and strategy in the national and international context. Ailsa has been a member of the Social Enterprise Strategy Reference Group and the Census Working Group. Inspiralba is based in Campbelltown, where Ailsa can usually be found swimming at beaches up and down the Kintyre Peninsula, but today she is joining us from dry land. And now Thomas has just vanished. He's back. So Thomas, take a breather.
Thank you. It's lovely to participate in this conference away in Uist in the Outer Hebrides. I was just popped away because my children have just got home. So I've sorted that, and now I can focus on this. So, I mean, the question that they posed for this session was, have rural communities been involved in community wealth building? And of course they have. And I want to take Uist, where I live, as the example. But just before I set out some of the evidence, note that most of what I say was not driven by council policy or even strategic, but by island communities leading in responding to community needs and opportunities over the last 30 years. And in some ways, it is actually fortunate that we are separated from more centralized control, including from our own local authority in Stornoway by the sea. And that gives us a certain advantage, as well as many disadvantages. So if we look at the 5 headings that Argyll and Bute Council introduced us to, procurement, because it was not economical for the Western Isles Council to deliver all the services themselves in their remoter islands of Uist and Barra, they actually contracted out many of those services to local social enterprises. At times this was genuine partnership, at others it was a very unequal relationship, but work in progress. Fair employment. The one aspect that I want to draw attention to here is that the council invested very heavily in creating accredited qualifications in schools that met the needs of the local economy. And that was really, so leading to good jobs in the local economy. And that was quite radical at the time, rather than just educating for export. So our schools teach courses in crofting, local food production, Harris Tweed, traditional boat building, maritime skills, engineering, health and social care. In terms of land and assets, many of you will know that I think it's something like 70% of land in the Outer Hebrides is now community owned, run by dynamic community enterprises that are investing in and reviving island communities. And we have hugely talented human resources to do that. In terms of financial power, community enterprises, community landowners have brought in literally millions of pounds of investments into Uist, in wind turbines, harbours, marinas, new offices and housing, community education, recycling, cultural centres. The last one, the cultural centre, we've got a 7 million cultural centre being built at the moment. Plural ownership. Because we are separated from the mainstream economy, micro enterprises are at the core of our local economy, as are social enterprises. And according to the social enterprise census, the islands have by far the highest concentration of social enterprises per 10,000 population. In Shetland, at the top of that list, it's 47. In the Outer Hebrides, it's 45. And indeed, research in South Uist a while ago estimated that there is about one social enterprise for every 100 people on Uist. For us, it's almost as social enterprise as a way of life. If there's one lesson that I take away from all of this, build on the many assets, including dynamic and talented human resources that are available to most rural communities. Build on assets. So in Uist, even though we have a small population of 5,000, social enterprises are delivering numerous services from land management to cultural and health and social care. Social enterprises led or involved in 111 out of 117 development projects on Uist, identified about 7-8 years ago. The third sector generates 12% of jobs outside the public sector. And critically, the most recent research suggests it generates 10% of all jobs for those in their 20s and 30s. And that includes all jobs, including in the public sector. We've accessed millions of pounds of investment, and we're at the heart of the cultural revival that is really revitalizing what's going on here in Uist. So what I want to point out is how much significant experience and expertise, including in advanced sectors, is available in this tiny community of 5,000. So just to give you one example, in the medical sector, we have a manager of medical research projects who lives down the road from where I live. We have in the neighbouring island of North Uist, the former head of a R&D at a major medical equipment innovation company who continues to work for the company. And we have on Grimsay, the specialist manufacturer of dental supplies. This is a small community of 5,000. I could give you examples from every single sector. And then it's also a very attractive community because of all our community wealth building and our focus on community at the heart of everything we do. It's become increasingly attractive for younger islanders up to the age of 40. And a couple of years ago, we tracked 469 of those younger islanders, and half of those were returners or newcomers. Half of them had stayed, half of them returners or newcomers. 4 out of the 10 children who live on Uist are here because both their parents have chosen to return or settle on Uist. So this is a shift in population trends, but partly because of how strong our local communities are, which demonstrates if we can get community wealth building right, then people will move back, including younger people. And 10% of all those young people run their own enterprises, from crofting to a new distillery, from sustainable tourism to internationally renowned artists. So it's a very vibrant base. So what I would conclude, first, build on assets, and secondly, recognize the huge talent available to rural communities. And it's often gone unnoticed within policy circles, sometimes even within themselves. And when I present on this about Uist, many people say, oh, I wish it was like that in my area. We may be ahead on the curve, but there's huge talent and there are huge assets in every rural community that I've ever been to. And I've worked in India and in Africa and in many other places. When I came to Uist, I recognized how far ahead they were, but they can be trailblazers for many other areas across Scotland. Thank you.
Thank you, Thomas. Didn't even have to use my well-curated number one. Okay. Yeah, well, I think we'll follow on with if Ailsa wants to share some viewpoints from Argyll and Bute and your work across the rest of Scotland as well.
Ailsa, from Ailsa to another. Just to start off, it's just really to say that I'm always inspired by the passion, energy, and determination within rural. I'm really fortunate to be able to work alongside such a range of social enterprises in islands, small towns, and villages across our rural area. I've been struck by the importance of collective leadership, which brings a range of expertise and interest from across the community to assist in finding creative solutions to challenges. And I think this is an area that we can really learn from. I don't think we've done enough work on how that collective leadership actually is important, both in the rural and the urban context. I think this also highlights the important contribution of people within a locality working to benefit that community. In the recent months, I've really emphasised the importance of localism and those local connections. I think the traditional profit-based model, which has been used to describe success in society as a whole and in our sector, can be really difficult to emulate in a rural context, where an enterprising approach often involves juggling a complex mix of trading activity alongside grants and donations, basically doing anything to keep the wheels on the bus. And within that context, measuring success on the size of your bottom line really doesn't serve well. I think I've worked with many organisations with a modest turnover, but the contribution of their services really underpins the sustainability of their community as a whole. Social enterprises responding to market failure is a big feature in a rural context, and that requires a very different approach to business. And perhaps in the coming months, we're going to need to have that kind of approach more generically across society. We've seen across our rural communities that they've been able to respond to the challenges of delivering services that traditionally would have been commercial or public sector, but economic constraints have meant that those traditional business models didn't offer sufficient profitability or service budget cuts. With services from shops, petrol stations, cinemas, and care for older people, amongst the very broad range of things that are delivered by social enterprises. As traditional businesses face challenges, there may be a need for more community-led services in urban areas as well, and I think there'll be a lot of learning to bring from that. I've seen firsthand the sheer grit and determination that lends itself to the longevity of many of our rural social enterprises. So on the resilience scale, they may look like they're weak because they don't show growth, their turnover isn't very big and their reserves are modest, but they've managed to keep it all going for the last 25 years. And again, I think that's how do we measure what's success and what is failure in this very new situation that we find ourselves. Rural social enterprises have taken a lead in securing significant assets that have then been utilised for community benefit. Thomas also reflected on this, whether that's renewables, land or buildings. And this collective approach to managing assets for community benefits has such huge potential for learning for society as a whole and for our densely populated areas. And it's heartening to see the momentum of community ownership growing in urban areas too. The impacts of COVID-19 has further reinforced my belief that solutions are often found within the local context, with so many examples of community resilience efforts where social enterprises were right at the heart, taking a leadership role. When business as usual was suspended, these locally based enterprises have been able to work with a range of partners to mobilise local resources, generate wider investment and respond to needs in record time. The financial challenges ahead are going to require some of that grit and determination that I mentioned earlier, and also probably a very different view of what is success. The experience we've gained over the last 6 months shines a light on the measure of wealth in a much broader sense and recognises the value of community and the environment much more front and centre. That doesn't detract from some of the challenges and the need for income or the negative impact that loss of jobs can potentially have on our communities. And it brings wider challenges with the desire to relocate to the country and the knock-on effect that might have on the availability of affordable housing in our rural areas, where sadly out-migration is still a big feature in many of the communities I work with. So that need for grit and determination also highlights the value of sustaining vital services, and they're going to be needed now more than ever as we move forward, with many businesses and social enterprises finding themselves in challenging times with the loss of markets and financial insecurity. But that kind of innovative and resilient approach, I think we can share, more broadly, and I think that is at the heart of many social enterprises. Partnership working and sharing learning has long been valued in the rural context. I've worked with Thomas and I've worked with many others. There's not the same kind of protectionism of what we do in our area. And I think that kind of shared approach is really important. And I think some of the work that we've done with the Rural Social Enterprise Hub to share that learning, we can build on as we move forward. And I hope that can be cascaded more widely in terms of the urban context as well. So just to sum up then, we've found that our work with partners across Europe has highlighted the synergy of community development and social enterprise for the rural context. And I think that approach to seeing social enterprise and community development as very aligned will help us overcome the challenges as we move ahead, and will help add value to that approach to community wealth building. We've developed a whole range of tools and resources based around that model that are hosted on the Rural Hub, and we'd certainly welcome anybody to become involved in that and learn from those resources, and are always up for that ongoing learning, because I think we're going to need to find new ways as we move forward.
Thanks very much. Virtual round of applause to both of our speakers there. Both very interesting insights to Uist, Argyll and across Scotland. At the moment, do we have any questions from the audience? We haven't had any in the chat just now. If anyone would like to request to turn on their video and audio and come on and pose a question or an observation to the speakers, feel free to do so. Fabio, I'll take you first, and then Kate. Oh no, okay, Kate just now. Okay, both disappeared. Oh. Hello.
Hi.
Hi, Fabio. Have you got a question for either Ailsa or Thomas or both?
Well, I'd be interested in the answers from both. And just picking up, I think, on something I heard from Thomas, which was, it made it sound that, so it's this tension between what a local authority or an agency of the state in general can do to support or hinder community development, community empowerment, an enterprising approach in our communities, and community wealth-being itself. And it almost sounded like it was almost benign neglect and almost a failure of both private sector and public sector, which opened the space for community wealth building before the word maybe was in wide use. And just wondered if both of you wanted to expand on that, because I certainly wouldn't want us to develop a social policy that says let's give let's leave rural communities to kind of fester, and then hopefully they rise to the challenge. If not, well, they just die out. So what? So maybe we'd like to hear your exploration of what a benign social policy might be.
Let me start with that. In terms of the private sector, definitely not benign neglect. And we're small island economies, so as Ailsa pointed to, there are market failures. And within that context, you get a very unique kind of business structure, which is very much focused on micro businesses, a few small businesses, and just a handful of larger businesses. And social enterprise is also very significant. And it's that broad mix of businesses. And the distinctions between a private business and a social enterprise also starts blurring in this community. All our enterprises, micro enterprises, are deeply committed to the community because they're part of it. And I remember the case where the biggest builder here, US Build, UBCs, who had overextended into Inverness and then collapsed, I was working for the training institute at that time, expected to see a lot of those workers at the institute so that we could retrain and so on. None of them came. They had all got absorbed by cousins and micro businesses saying, oh, just come along, I'm building a house, you can help me on this. And that shows the huge resilience of the micro enterprise sector for our economies, which is hugely important. And I want to stress how important it is to invest in that and not just in large investments seeking the magic bullet of a big company coming in, which is often not sustainable. In terms of the council, some of it has been benign neglect. Some of it has been because we are, you know, just the logistical challenges of delivering services in this area. But it has really, I moved to and fro in my attitudes towards this. It's been, to some extent, it's been an advantage to us. In other aspects, it's clearly been a disadvantage. And we have sometimes succeeded in creating very good partnerships. And at other times, it's much less so. And for the CWB, I think, generally across Scotland, I think one of the huge challenges is going to, if public institutions are able to let go of their controlling approach to local communities and local services. They see it as their mandate, and they often see they're the only ones capable of delivering it properly. And unless we have that shift, CWB is not really going to work that well.
Ailsa, do you want to come in on this as well?
Yeah, I would say that, you know, obviously not all rural areas are the same, and we have, you know, large private sector businesses here, and we've been quite badly hit by the impact of inward investment then leaving an area once the subsidies run out, time and time again, leaving fairly major shocks to quite remote rural communities in terms of where are the alternatives. So I agree with Thomas in terms of that need to recognise the collective value of micro enterprises across the board. In terms of the work and the partnerships or not partnerships, as sometimes is the case with the public sector more broadly, you know, I think a lot of that is about power and control, and having that shared respect and shared responsibility. I think there's a lot of work to be done. We did some work several years back with support from Carnegie UK and HIE, which was about local services and their delivery by the third sector, just recognising, you know, the value of that nimbleness and ability to innovate and change and respond to needs, but also the challenges of financial sustainability and the need for external expertise. So clearly, you know, there's huge potential in the third sector and public sector working collectively. I think where the challenges come in are in relation to those different levels of, I don't know how to say it tactfully, but sometimes the big players are less willing to let go. And I think that kind of power shift is going to be really important if we're able to crack this. And we're going to need to crack it, because the bottom line is the resources are not going to be there to maintain the status quo as it is.
Thanks very much, Fabio. I'm going to send you back into the audience now. And Kate, would you like to come in with your question? Thank you for waiting patiently there.
Thank you. It's not really, well, I suppose it's a question and an observation, which is around, I've just noticed, and perhaps I'm slow to notice, that during and since COVID, some communities appear are just getting on with things without necessarily asking for permission of a public body or whoever it might be to get on and do it. I work in the sector, but I live in a rural community, and somebody had an idea which we've talked about for years. COVID was the thing that kind of got the conversation into action, which was to put up a community greenhouse with veg seedlings for people to drop off and share and that kind of thing. We didn't ask permission, we didn't do a feasibility study, we didn't do a business plan, we got a cheap greenhouse and a load of pallets and stuck it up against a wall. And at some point, all those factors will come in if we want to see the project grow. But I suppose my question is, has anyone else noticed that too? Do communities increasingly think, I don't have to get permission for this? I mean, perhaps from your own community for sure, but you no longer need to go up this sort of hierarchy to give you that freedom to do something that is relevant and useful.
Thank you, Kate. I'm going to also send you back into the audience and get Ailsa to come in on that one. Thank you very much.
I think COVID really brought to light the need for expediency, and with that came an element of bravery. So whereas historically you would kind of think, all right, I need to ask permission to do X, Y, and Z, or wait for the guidance to come out, the guidance wasn't coming out quick enough for a number of communities, and therefore, you know, whether that was getting food to shielded households or getting laptops out to families so as kids could engage with their schoolwork, folk did just get on with it. And I think that demonstrated that the capacity is there, and actually sometimes waiting for the rule book to arrive, which did arrive in terms of COVID, sometimes, you know, weeks or even months late, it wasn't really appropriate. And actually having that level of trust in communities is something that we can build on. But I think it's something we also need to learn from. How do we therefore ensure that that shared respect and shared willingness to trust continues beyond the heart of the crisis as we move forward?
Yeah.
I'd just like to reinforce what you say, Ailsa. And the Scottish Rural Action Survey of COVID responses demonstrated very clearly across rural areas across Scotland that local communities were much more agile in responding to COVID. It took public institutions a lot longer. And the Scottish Government and local authorities did give a lot of trust and indeed resources to help communities forward. The key question now is whether communities are going to be shown the same trust and resources as we come out and rebuild and redesign our rural economies. And the signals at the moment are not positive on that. We seem to be quickly reverting to public sector control of issues and decisions being taken without proper community involvement, let alone empowerment. So that is a real challenge. It is not just through COVID. I mean, that's what I've learned from US for the 20 years here. Our community is an island community. We've had to survive crises going back centuries, and we've found ways of doing that. And the strength of the social enterprise sector here is responding to needs that are identified in the community and saying, if we don't get and do it, we won't, nobody else will. And sometimes the public sector has really bought into that, which has been great. And other times they felt threatened by that.
Yeah. We have a message come in from Wendy Pring in the chat. Trust is the critical word. An approach that requires each community to look at the sustainable, and this requires strong, inclusive leadership to ensure wealth building. I guess if we've not got a question at the minute, then I would like to pose one. I think you both mentioned, in light of COVID-19, and before that as well, the growth of social enterprise and community organisations in the urban context. And I just wanted to ask you both, really, you've both highlighted the years of experience that rural and island communities have coming together just to get stuff done. And what do you think are the key lessons for community wealth building and social enterprise in general that you think can be learned from rural areas? Whoever can come in first, whoever's quickest.
Okay. I go, or do you want to go, Tom? I don't mind. I'll go.
Well, don't mind.
That's fine.
Yeah.
I think there's a few factors there. I think we're really fortunate when you live rurally and remotely. You kind of know people, and I think from my experience, you know, I've lived in Edinburgh and Glasgow. Some of that's been lost, and I think that's really important. So how we then reignite that awareness of localism and that community connectedness is going to be really important to be able to transfer some of that. I think the issues that we've covered in terms of collective leadership is going to be really important, and I think it's something that we've perhaps missed on. within the social enterprise sector historically, a lot of it has been focused on the kind of individual entrepreneur model. But I think we need to be looking more at that collective leadership and collective responses to bring that level of learning up to speed, to be able to support communities to move forward with solutions. So I think there are two key highlights to start with, and I'll hand over to Thomas.
I think what I find most interesting at the moment in the remote communities is, as I've mentioned earlier, when younger people are returning. And I think that's actually quite a challenge for urban areas, because there's now, at least among wealthy urbanites, a flight from cities, as we're seeing with buying up properties on spec anywhere in rural Scotland where they haven't even been before. And we've had cases that on the islands already, where young people have lost the houses they were putting an offer in as they've been snapped up by people who've never even been to these islands. But young people do want to come back. And the question I pose, I've lived in cities earlier in my career for many years. The question I pose: what will be the equivalent in urban areas to attract younger, dynamic entrepreneurs back into those communities? Which often, if they're poor communities, if you do well, they leave. And that was always the mantra in a rural area. If you want to get on in life, you leave. That is no longer the case, and that's partly with the climate crisis and young people thinking differently about what they want out of life. It's changes in the economic structures, so you don't have lifelong careers anymore. And now it's been really accelerated by COVID. The other thing I want to point out is the difficulty, it's a challenge for the social enterprise sector. To some extent, we've had to be so dynamic and creative because of a failure of local democracy. So the fact that we talk about public, private and community sector so often in our conversation. So I was recently in a partnership across the North Atlantic. I was speaking to somebody who comes from one of the smallest islands in the far north of Norway. And she worked for the public authority, which is, of course, that island is no larger than Uist. And in Norway, they have their own local authorities at a much lower level. And she just didn't understand that tension between public, private, and the community sector. Because they're much more localized, fully resourced, and fully empowered democratic structures, it was much easier for them to work as a community, regardless of which sector they happen to sit in. Whereas here in Scotland, because we have a very centralized governance structure, both nationally and indeed with vast local authorities, there are much more tensions where centralized local authorities don't fully understand what's going on, even in some of their own remotest regions.
Yeah. Do we have anyone who wanted to come in for probably the final question? Oh, Fabio. Okay. If you want to press the button on the top, or I can read out your question if you'd like to pop onto screen. Yeah, here we go.
Happy either way. So really the question is picking up on what I've heard from both Ailsa and Thomas, but Ailsa articulated it particularly strongly, is how do you actually square that circle of combining and ensuring synergy between individual entrepreneurship and collective leadership, so the tension between the individual and the community.
I don't think there necessarily needs to be a tension. I think part of the challenge is that historically, particularly probably over the past 20 odd years, the focus has purely been on the individual. And I think we've lost sight of the value of community and that collective leadership approach. So I think it's more about getting a clearer balance. I think within the collective approach, there are individuals that have that kind of individual and entrepreneurial skill, but it's about, collective leadership models are about more of a kind of democratic approach to making those decisions. And it's not, you know, everything in the garden isn't rosy. We all understand that there are personality clashes, and, you know, it's not some ideal that it always works really well. And I think that's why we do need to invest in more learning, training and support for that collective approach, because I do feel that it has been missed out somewhat as we've all had our eyes drawn to the whole individualistic approach to entrepreneurialism. I would see that some of the social enterprises that I've worked with have been incredibly entrepreneurial, and they've been able to be more entrepreneurial because they've brought those collective ideas together for that collective benefit.
Thanks very much.
I would agree.
I think we'll just try and get one last question. Fabio, I'm going to send you back. And Jackie, if you'd like to request to come on, then I might direct the last question at Thomas just before we wrap up at 5 minutes past. Okay. She should be appearing soon.
I can see the question in the chat.
Yeah, okay. So thoughts on how to shift.
Oh, there you go.
Landing.
Great.
Okay.
You caught me knitting while I'm listening. So,
Great.
So I was just wondering, Thomas, I was especially interested in what you were saying about this tension between sort of localities and government agencies, and how Scotland has a particularly centralized structure, and Norway, you know, has a different one. And so I'm wondering, kind of like, what are the ways to ameliorate that tension or deal with that tension in a way that doesn't like require completely taking down the Scottish government and reorganizing it so it's less centralized, because that's certainly a big project. But like, what are other ways that we can kind of build more trust and kind of shift that that sort of hierarchical relationship?
I would suggest 3 ways. One is that we need greater decentralization of power and resources. The trends in Britain, across Britain, have been in the opposite direction. That's really not helpful. A second is stronger partnerships. So we've seen Ailsa working on community wealth building. That would work well. But I think COVID has really opened up an opportunity to invest in the existing grassroots democratic structures we have, and that's community councils. And they've had to step forward in times of COVID. They've done a variety of things. Some have been better, others have really struggled. But that is a tier of democratic governance that has very little power, has almost no resources. In our area, it has been in the past largely used for councillors to distribute certain amounts of money to their local community. If we could really invest in building up the capacity, the power and the resources of that sector, I think that could really help in addressing that democratic deficit at the most local level. And here on Uist community councils, we've got 10 18-year-olds on our community councils, and we've got 5 other young people, including one who chairs it, and the vice chair is also a young person. So they can also be avenues for young people to take real action if they are resourced and given power to act.
Thank you, Jackie. I'll send you back now. And Ailsa, would you like to come in with any parting words before we wrap up with 2 minutes to go?
Any parting words? I think, you know, just building on what Thomas was saying there, I think that the time ahead is going to be quite challenging for young people. And I think one of the things that we've been able to highlight is the significant contribution that young people can make to our local communities and our social enterprises. But we've had a bit of a deficit of young people's involvement, particularly at a kind of board and management level. So I think there's scope to build on that work. And I also think that filters down to that democratic level as well. You know, if young people are informed and inspired and feel confident about engaging in decision making, whether that's in social enterprises or the community councils, then there'll be more of that collective leadership skill set that's required as we move forward.
Thank you very much. thank you to both speakers, and thank you to everyone who viewed and came on stage, even if they were busy knitting. I guess the key points from that would be about the challenges that COVID-19 has brought about, or maybe not even brought about, but highlighted, that were maybe pre-existing, and that while there are tensions between local government and national government, sorry, trying to keep an eye on the chat at the same time, yeah, ways that don't require bringing down the whole Scottish government are good ways to go forward. There's some links in the chat there to both the Rural Hub and to Codal from Thomas and Ailsa, if you want to look at those. And now we have a very short 5-minute comfort break before we're going to rejoin the main stage for the closing remarks. So if that's a cup of tea or a dram of whiskey, then go and enjoy that. And thanks everyone for coming to this session.
Aye. Well done, you.
Thanks.
Thank you, Ailsa.
Oh, thank you, Thomas.
Thank
That was
you
grand.
very much.
Considering we didn't compare notes beforehand, I think we did all right actually in covering different points, so that's good.
Very good job. Yeah, totally. It's hard to sum up when people have been talking for 20 minutes. I mean,
Aye.
someone, Mark Johnson's wanting to come on.
Oh,
hello.
Hey guys, how are you?
Hello, Mark.
Hi, Mark.
Hi, good,
I'm
thanks.
just taking the opportunity to do a bit of networking where we'll get a brief break and tell you what I've been up to myself, get a little bit of feedback from the rural community. So I'm establishing a social enterprise at the minute that we're currently referring to as My Town. And the idea behind My Town is that users at the point whereby they join would effectively self-evaluate and self-educate in regards to their own ethics and values. So that might be anything from wishing to consume local produce to want to buy from real living wage employers, interested in environmentally sound alternatives or social alternatives. So that could be anything from a beeswax wrap to a Hey Girls tampon to something for the local butcher, baker, candlestick maker, effectively, and essentially that the produce would be ranked accordingly in the way that, you know, it becomes almost like a race to the top of who's the most ethical rather than how good is your search engine optimization almost. And the idea is that this sort of digital app and mechanism would be linked to a delivery service. So I was just curious as to see how you guys felt something like that might play out in a rural context. For myself, even living as a resident in somewhere like Wishaw, you know, to consume socially and ethically isn't particularly easy in somewhere like Wishaw, even when you've got Glasgow on your doorstep. So, or even to be in Glasgow, you know, you've got multiple social enterprises there, but they're all spread about the town. So I was just interested how you felt that might play out rurally.
I think a couple of things, Mark. One is sometimes, particularly small rural social enterprises don't always have the capacity to fill out the forms that would show quite how ethical and socially driven they are.
Mm-hmm.
But the bigger organisations can. So it's how you manage to get that kind of equality pegged in at the start. And
So
I suppose having that
almost like a facilitation in terms of how they would sign up to the platform almost.
Yeah, and also maybe providing the opportunity to weight things. So perhaps, you know, having a localism search functionality.
Yeah.
Yes, that's I suppose for me, with the app being called My Town, you know, placemaking is really key. So the idea would be that it would provide you as a priority sort of local solutions first and let you know what was available at a localized level. But the idea perhaps is to backfill it. I don't know if to take, you know, I used Hey Girls tampons as an example earlier on. You know, I don't think, you know, that's something that's going to be getting manufactured at a regional level. So the idea is to provide those social alternatives and allow those to sort of grow and spread within the social, you know, an environment that's weighted for social enterprise. But also,
it's interesting because someone literally wrote in the chat at the start of the day there should be an Amazon for social enterprise products and services.
Wow, where was that?
Yeah.
And Mark, let me give you a concrete example that happened during COVID. The Aisle 20 was set up by an entrepreneur in Tyree, and has enlisted almost 500 island businesses, many of whom were able to survive during COVID because of that platform.
Yeah.
She's now setting up Isle Eats, which she's trialing on Tyree to encourage local food delivery and so on. So, and like Ailsa, I would put the emphasis, the remoter you get, the greater emphasis localism has
For sure.
to be, because we're not going to manufacture everything here. There's no way that would ever happen. But that localism, but also if you get remote, obviously we're buying lots of products.
Guys, I'm so sorry, Thomas. Can we share emails, because we need to go back to the main stage? Joe and Maeve are on to me.
Get in touch, Mark, no problem.
Yep.
Just give us a shout.
Yeah, get in touch, Mark. Great.
Cheers, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.